The alien girl's loneliness. The sky above the desolate planet was painted in shades of gray and red, clouds swirling like restless ghosts. Lyra stood motionless on the frozen ground, her translucent skin glowing faintly under the dim light of the twin moons. She stared at the sleek silver ship rising into the air, her heart sinking as it disappeared into the heavy clouds. They were gone. Her family, her people, they had left her behind. Lyra clenched her hands into fists, her sharp nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt tight, choked by the realization of abandonment. Her species, the HFY, were known for their cold logic and unyielding priorities. Weakness, in their eyes, was a burden that could not be carried. And Lyra had always been considered weak. Her mind replayed the final moments before the evacuation. "You will slow us down, Lyra," her father had said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Survival comes first. You understand, don't you?" She had begged them to reconsider, her violet eyes brimming with tears. Her mother hadn't even looked at her. Her brother, who once promised to protect her, stood silently as the ship's door closed. Now she was alone on a planet that was slowly dying. The ground was cracked and lifeless, and the air was bitterly cold. The HFY had abandoned this world long ago, stripping it of resources and leaving only barren wastelands. Lyra shivered as the wind howled around her, its icy touch seeping through her thin clothing. She looked around, searching for shelter. The horizon stretched endlessly, a wasteland of jagged rocks and dust storms. Her energy reserves were low, and without sustenance, she wouldn't last long. She wrapped her arms around herself, her body trembling from more than just the cold. As Lyra began to walk, the weight of loneliness settled heavily on her. Every step felt like a struggle, the silence pressing against her ears. Her kind were telepathic, their minds connected in a vast network of thoughts and emotions. Now she could hear nothing but her own breathing and the crunch of her boots against the frozen ground. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time felt meaningless. The twin moons rose higher, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move. Lyra's sharp senses picked up faint sounds in the distance, whispers carried by the wind. She froze, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of the wind. But then she heard it again, a low growl, guttural and menacing. Her instincts screamed danger. The HFY had warned her about the predators that roamed this planet, creatures born from the planet's harsh conditions. Lyra's breathing quickened as she scanned her surroundings, her violet eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The growl came again, louder this time, and Lyra saw movement out of the corner of her eye. A dark shape, low to the ground, creeping closer. Panic surged through her as she realized she had no weapon, no way to defend herself. She broke into a run, her thin legs carrying her as fast as they could. The creature gave chase, its heavy footsteps pounding against the ground. Lyra could hear its snarls, feel its hot breath as it closed the distance. Desperation drove her forward. She spotted a cluster of jagged rocks ahead and scrambled toward them, her hands and knees scraping against the sharp edges. She wedged herself into a narrow crevice, her body trembling as she pressed herself against the cold stone. The creature stopped just outside, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. It sniffed the air, its massive body silhouetted against the moonlight. Lyra held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. She could see the sharp glint of its teeth, its claws digging into the ground as it waited. Minutes passed, then an hour, and the creature finally retreated into the shadows. Lyra exhaled shakily, her muscles aching from staying so still. She crawled out of the crevice, her body weak and her mind racing. She couldn't stay here. The creature would return, and next time, she might not be so lucky. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry. Silent tears ran down her cheeks, freezing as they fell to the ground. She felt small and insignificant, a fragile spark of life in a vast and uncaring universe. But even as despair threatened to consume her, a flicker of determination, ignited within her. "I will survive," she whispered to herself, her voice firm despite her fear. Lyra looked up at the twin moons, their light reflecting in her tear-streaked eyes. Somewhere out there, beyond the endless sky, was a chance, a hope that she clung to with all her strength. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she refused to give up. For now, that was enough. A human's unexpected encounter. Daniel adjusted the hood of his thick parka, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The icy wilderness stretched endlessly before him, the silence broken only by the occasional crunch of snow beneath his boots. This place, this remote, desolate corner of Earth, was where he felt most alive. Alone, yes, but alive. He was here for research, collecting data for an experimental project on adapting Earth-like conditions to inhospitable planets. His equipment, a mix of advanced radar systems and old-fashioned survival gear, was spread out across his camp. The vast expanse of untouched snow and ice was a challenge he relished. But that night, something felt different. The faint hum of his portable radar broke through the quiet. Daniel froze, his eyes darting toward the small screen. A life form. Out here, impossible. The area was hundreds of miles away from any human settlement, and he had accounted for the local wildlife. Yet the radar was picking up a faint signal, a warm presence moving erratically through the snow. He frowned, adjusting the sensitivity. Could be a glitch, he muttered to himself, but the signal persisted. Curiosity got the better of him. Grabbing his flashlight and his rifle, just in case, Daniel ventured out into the frozen night. The cold bit at his exposed face as he moved toward the signal, his boots sinking into the deep snow. As he walked, the radar's beeping grew faster. Daniel's heart quickened. Whatever it was close. The beam of his flashlight swept across the snow-covered terrain until it landed on something unexpected. A figure. At first, he thought it was a human, but as he stepped closer, he realized it was something else entirely. The figure was small and delicate, with shimmering, almost translucent skin that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Strange, violet eyes stared back at him, wide with fear and exhaustion. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. An alien. The creature was struggling to stay upright, its fragile body shivering uncontrollably in the bitter cold. It wore some kind of form-fitting suit, torn in several places, and its hands clutched at its chest as if in pain. Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. Should he approach? Was it dangerous? He tightened his grip on the rifle, but something in the alien's eyes stopped him. It wasn't a threat. It was terrified. "Hey," he said softly, lowering the rifle and raising his free hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The alien flinched at the sound of his voice, but didn't move away. Daniel noticed the shallow rise and fall of its chest, its breaths coming in rapid, uneven gasps. Whatever it was in bad shape. "All right," he murmured, kneeling slowly to avoid scaring it. "Let's get you out of the cold." The alien didn't resist as Daniel wrapped his thick jacket around its trembling body. It was impossibly light, almost weightless, as he scooped it up and carried it back to his camp. When they reached his igloo-like shelter, Daniel gently placed the alien on a makeshift cot near the small heater. The warmth seemed to bring some color back to its shimmering skin, but its violet eyes remained wary, darting around the room. Daniel rummaged through his supplies, pulling out a bottle of water. He hesitated before offering it, unsure if the alien could even drink it. "Here," he said, holding it out. The alien stared at him for a long moment before cautiously reaching out with trembling fingers. It took the bottle, its movements clumsy and slow, and sniffed the contents before taking a tentative sip. Daniel watched in fascination. It was intelligent, no doubt about that. But why was it here? And more importantly, what had happened to it? Before he could ask himself any more questions, a low, guttural growl echoed outside the shelter. Daniel froze, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle propped against the wall. The alien's eyes widened in terror, and it made a soft, high-pitched sound, almost like a warning. The growling grew louder, and the walls of the igloo trembled slightly. Daniel's pulse quickened. Something was out there. Something big. He glanced at the alien, whose expression was one of pure fear. Whatever was out there, it was hunting them. Grabbing his rifle, Daniel moved to the entrance of the igloo, his body tense. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, without warning, something massive slammed against the entrance. A fragile bond begins. The icy night wrapped around the small shelter like a predator waiting to pounce. Inside the makeshift igloo, Daniel knelt beside the alien, his thoughts racing. He could see it shivering under his thick jacket, its translucent skin glowing faintly in the dim light. It looked so fragile, so utterly out of place in this harsh, frozen wilderness. The growls outside had stopped for now, but Daniel knew the silence wouldn't last. Whatever was out there, it was dangerous and persistent. The alien stirred, its violet eyes fluttering open. For a moment, it seemed dazed, but then its gaze locked on Daniel. Fear flickered across its face, and it scrambled back against the igloo wall, clutching the jacket tightly around itself. Hey, Daniel said, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal sign of peace. It's okay. You're safe here. The alien's breathing was rapid, its wide eyes darting around the small space. Daniel realized that to it, he might look like the threat. He was a stranger, and worse, a human. He didn't know what this alien knew, or thought it knew, about humans, but he had a feeling it wasn't good. I'm not going to hurt you, he said slowly, keeping his voice calm. He pointed to himself. Daniel. The alien blinked but didn't respond. It seemed to be studying him, its sharp gaze flickering between his face, his hands, and the rifle propped against the wall. Daniel decided to take a risk. He grabbed a metal canteen from his gear and poured a bit of water into a small bowl. Sliding it slowly across the floor, he sat back on his heels to give the alien space. For a long moment, it didn't move. Then, cautiously, it reached out, its delicate fingers brushing the bowl. It sniffed the water, hesitated, and then drank. Daniel exhaled in relief. That's right. See, I'm on your side. The alien finished the water and set the bowl down. It tilted its head, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Daniel could almost feel the tension in the air easing, but then the alien spoke. Its voice was soft, melodic, but the words were incomprehensible. A series of lilting sounds and sharp clicks filled the space, and Daniel could only stare, his mind struggling to make sense of the alien language. I don't understand, he admitted, shaking his head. He gestured to himself again. Daniel. My name is Daniel. The alien frowned, as if trying to mimic him. Its lips moved awkwardly, and after a few attempts, it managed to say, Da. Neil. Daniel grinned. That's it. You got it. The alien didn't smile back, but the fear in its eyes softened slightly. It hesitated, then tapped its chest lightly. Lyra. Daniel nodded. Lyra. Nice to meet you. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, an uneasy but growing understanding forming between them. Daniel could see that Lyra was exhausted, her body trembling despite the warmth of the shelter. He reached for a blanket and held it out to her, moving slowly so as not to startle her. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a brief second. Her skin was cool, almost icy, but Daniel felt the spark of something else, something unspoken. Before he could say anything, the growl returned. Low, guttural, and much closer than before. Lyra's eyes widened, and she gripped the blanket tightly. Her voice, though still soft, was filled with urgency as she spoke in her strange language. Daniel didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Danger. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the entrance of the igloo, peering out into the darkness. The faint glow of moonlight revealed nothing, but he could feel it, the presence of something massive, lurking just beyond the edge of visibility. Suddenly, the creature let out a deafening roar, and the igloo trembled. Daniel's grip on the rifle tightened. He glanced back at Lyra, who was huddled against the wall, her eyes pleading. "Stay here," he said, though he doubted she understood. Stepping outside, Daniel faced the cold head-on, his heart pounding. He didn't know what kind of nightmare was stalking them, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let it get to her. A dangerous chase. The biting wind howled through the frozen wilderness, carrying with it an ominous growl that seemed to echo from every direction. Daniel crouched low, rifle in hand, his breath misting in the frigid air. Behind him, Lyra huddled close, her translucent skin dimming as fear drained what little energy she had left. "Keep quiet," Daniel whispered over his shoulder, his voice barely audible over the wind. Lyra didn't respond, but he could feel her trust, or desperation, growing with each moment. She had no other choice. Neither did he. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps shattered the stillness. Daniel spun toward the noise, his flashlight sweeping across the snow-covered landscape. It landed on a pair of glowing eyes, low to the ground but massive. "Damn," Daniel muttered under his breath. The beast was bigger than he'd expected. It was like nothing he had ever seen. Its body was covered in jagged black scales that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Each breath it exhaled sent plumes of steam into the freezing air. Long claws raked the ground, and its fangs glinted as it snarled, its gaze fixed on them. Daniel didn't wait. "Run," he shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her to her feet. They bolted through the snow, Daniel leading the way. Lyra stumbled at first, her legs trembling, but adrenaline, or something alien, seemed to kick in, and she kept pace. The beast roared behind them, its footsteps thunderous as it gave chase. "Why does it always have to be monsters?" Daniel muttered, his breath coming in gasps. The terrain was unforgiving, the snow deep and uneven. Daniel's boots sank with every step, slowing him down, but Lyra moved with a strange grace, her alien physiology adapting to the environment. Over there, Daniel pointed to a cluster of jagged rocks ahead. They could use the terrain to their advantage, at least for a moment. The beast's growls grew louder, and Daniel dared to glance back. It was closing in, its powerful limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. As they reached the rocks, Daniel turned and fired his rifle. The sound cracked through the air, and the bullet struck the creature's shoulder. It stumbled but didn't stop, its glowing eyes now blazing with rage. "Great, now it's angry," Daniel muttered. Lyra's voice broke through the chaos, sharp and urgent. She pointed to a narrow crevice between the rocks, gesturing for them to hide. "It's not big enough for that thing," Daniel realized aloud. They scrambled into the crevice, their bodies pressed against the icy stone walls. The beast reached the rocks moments later, its claws scraping against the surface as it searched for them. Daniel held his breath, his heart pounding. Beside him, Lyra's faint glow returned, her violet eyes focused intently on the creature. She raised a trembling hand, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might be trying to do something. The creature sniffed the air, its massive head swinging toward their hiding spot. Daniel tightened his grip on the rifle, ready for a last stand. But before the beast could attack, Lyra's hand began to glow brighter. A soft hum filled the air, and the creature hesitated, its movements slowing. "What are you doing?" Daniel whispered, his voice tinged with awe and panic. Lyra didn't respond, her focus entirely on the beast. The glow from her hand pulsed rhythmically, and the creature let out a low, confused growl. It turned its head away, as if disoriented, and then, with a frustrated snarl, it retreated into the shadows. Daniel exhaled shakily, his body still tense. What just happened?" Lyra slumped against the wall, her glow dimming again. Whatever she had done had drained her. She looked at him, her expression both apologetic and determined. "You saved us," Daniel said softly, his voice filled with disbelief. Lyra's eyes flickered with something. Gratitude, perhaps. But she didn't speak. Daniel leaned against the cold stone, his mind racing. They were alive, but for how long? The creature was still out there, and now they were trapped in this frozen wasteland with no clear plan for survival. One thing was certain, though. They were in this together. The turning point. The cave was eerily silent, save for the faint crackle of a small fire Daniel had managed to start with his emergency kit. The flickering light danced across the rough stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Lyra sat close to the flames, her knees drawn to her chest, her translucent skin reflecting the warm glow. Daniel glanced at her as he adjusted his gear. She looked exhausted, but her violet eyes remained alert, watching him with cautious curiosity. She still didn't trust him fully. He could see it in the way her fingers clenched around the blanket he'd given her. He couldn't blame her. She was an alien in a strange world, hunted by something far deadlier than either of them had anticipated. "You really pulled off some magic back there," Daniel said, breaking the silence. He wasn't sure if she understood him, but he needed to talk, if only to drown out the lingering fear in his mind. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You know," he continued, holding up the small device he'd rigged from parts of his radar, "I might have an idea to buy us some time." Her gaze flicked to the device, and her eyebrows furrowed. She leaned forward, curiosity overcoming her wariness. "This," Daniel explained, pointing to the exposed wires and blinking light, "is a decoy. It's not perfect, but it should emit enough heat and noise to lure that thing away from us." Lyra's eyes widened as she seemed to grasp the concept. She raised a delicate hand, gesturing at the device, then at herself. "No, no," Daniel said quickly, shaking his head. "You're not the bait. The machine is. It'll lead the beast somewhere else while we figure out our next move." Lyra hesitated, then nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. But before Daniel could feel any relief, a distant roar echoed through the cave. The sound was low and guttural, vibrating through the ground. Lyra tensed, her glow dimming as fear overtook her. "It's getting closer," Daniel muttered, grabbing his rifle and the decoy device. He checked his watch, calculating how long the batteries would last. Not long enough, but it was better than nothing. He turned to Lyra. "We have to move. This cave won't protect us if that thing finds us here." She nodded again, her movements stiff and uncertain. As they stepped outside, the frigid air hit them like a wall. The snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly, the moonlight reflecting off the white expanse. Daniel could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. They had no reinforcements, no rescue team, no guarantees. It was just the two of them. He set the decoy on the ground and activated it. The device let out a high-pitched whine and began to emit bursts of heat, mimicking a living creature. Lyra watched with wide eyes as the lights blinked rhythmically, like a heartbeat. "Now we run," Daniel said, his voice low. They moved quickly, sticking close to the rocky outcroppings for cover. Behind them, the decoy whined louder, its artificial warmth drawing the beast's attention. The creature's roar split the air, and Daniel didn't need to look back to know it was working. The heavy thud of its footsteps followed, veering toward the decoy. For a moment, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would give them the time they needed to regroup, to come up with a real plan. But then Lyra stopped abruptly, her hand shooting out to grab his arm. "What is it?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra pointed to the horizon. At first, Daniel saw nothing but the stark white expanse of snow. Then he noticed it, a faint, pulsing light in the distance. It wasn't natural, and it definitely wasn't the decoy. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. Lyra's expression shifted, a mixture of recognition and dread. She spoke quickly, her voice urgent, but Daniel couldn't understand her words. Before he could press her for answers, another roar rang out, this time much closer than he expected. The decoy had failed. "Run," Daniel shouted, pulling Lyra with him as the ground shook beneath their feet. Whatever lay on the horizon, whatever that pulsing light meant, it was their only hope now. Sacrifice and redemption. The icy wind howled like a living thing, tearing at Daniel and Lyra as they pressed forward toward the pulsing light in the distance. It was closer now, casting faint shadows on the endless snow, but their time was running out. Behind them, the beast roared, its heavy footsteps pounding against the frozen ground. It was faster than they'd anticipated, closing the gap despite their desperate pace. Daniel's heart pounded as he glanced at Lyra. Her glow was fading, her energy clearly drained. She couldn't keep going like this. Daniel skidded to a halt, his boots kicking up snow. "We can't outrun it," he said, gripping Lyra's arm to steady her. Her violet eyes locked onto his, wide with fear and confusion. She didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone. "I'll distract it," Daniel said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "You keep heading for the light. Whatever's out there, it's your best shot." Lyra shook her head vehemently, her hand gripping his arm tightly. Her expression was a mix of desperation and defiance, as if to say, "No, not like this." "Listen to me," Daniel said, his voice firm but gentle. "You've got something to live for. Whatever your people left you to find, you'll find it. But you need to go now." Lyra hesitated, her glowing hand trembling as it reached toward his chest. For a moment, Daniel felt a strange warmth spread through him, a fleeting connection he couldn't explain. Then the beast's roar shattered the moment, echoing through the frozen wasteland. Lyra took a step back, her face etched with sorrow. She raised her hand, her fingers brushing the air between them as if trying to say something. "Go," Daniel urged, motioning toward the light. She hesitated one last time, then turned and ran, her figure disappearing into the blinding snow. Daniel adjusted his grip on the rifle and turned to face the creature. It emerged from the storm like a nightmare-given form, its massive body blocking out the faint glow of the moon. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, and it let out a guttural growl that sent shivers down his spine. "All right, big guy," Daniel muttered, raising his rifle. "Let's dance." The beast charged, its claws tearing through the snow as it closed the distance. Daniel fired, the bullet striking its thick hide but barely slowing it down. He dived to the side at the last moment, narrowly avoiding its massive jaws. Scrambling to his feet, he reached for his pack, pulling out the last of his makeshift explosives. "This better work," he muttered, arming the device. The beast lunged again, and Daniel threw the explosive with all his strength. It hit the ground just in front of the creature and detonated with a deafening boom. The force of the blast sent Daniel sprawling, his ears ringing as snow and debris rained down around him. When he looked up, the beast was still standing, though its movements were slower now. Blood dripped from its wounds, staining the snow beneath it. Daniel gritted his teeth, readying his rifle for one last stand. But before the creature could strike, a sudden, blinding light erupted behind it. Lyra. She stood tall against the storm, her body glowing brighter than ever before. Her hands were raised, and waves of energy rippled outward, creating a visible distortion in the air. The beast hesitated, its head swinging toward her. "No," Daniel shouted, realizing what she was doing. Lyra didn't falter. The energy around her intensified, crackling like lightning. The beast roared in defiance, charging toward her, but it was too late. With a final, desperate cry, Lyra unleashed the full force of her power. The energy hit the beast like a tidal wave, tearing through its massive form and reducing it to ash. The snow around them melted in an instant, leaving only steaming ground in its wake. Daniel stumbled to his feet, his eyes wide as he took in the devastation. Lyra swayed where she stood, her glow dimming rapidly. "Lyra," he shouted, running to her as she collapsed into the snow. He caught her just in time, cradling her fragile body in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, and she managed a faint smile. "You didn't have to do that," Daniel said, his voice shaking. Lyra raised a trembling hand, brushing it against his cheek. Her lips moved, forming a word he couldn't understand but felt in his heart. "Hope," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel tightened his grip on her, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "You're going to be okay. We're going to make it." In the distance, the pulsing light grew brighter, illuminating the path forward. Daniel stood, carrying Lyra as he walked toward the unknown, his determination stronger than ever. They had survived the beast. Now they just had to survive whatever came next. Hope and new beginnings. The light grew brighter as Daniel trudged through the snow, Lyra cradled in his arms. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he refused to stop. Her faint glow had almost disappeared, and her breathing was shallow. He could feel the fragility of her body, but her hand still clung weakly to his jacket, as if she wasn't ready to give up either. As they neared the source of the pulsing light, it became clear that it wasn't natural. A shimmering dome of energy stood in the middle of the frozen expanse, humming softly. Strange symbols etched into the air spun slowly around it, casting shadows that shifted like living things. "What is this?" Daniel muttered, his voice hoarse. Lyra stirred slightly, her violet eyes fluttering open. When she saw the dome, a faint spark of recognition flickered in her gaze. She reached out weakly, pointing toward it. "This is why you came here, isn't it?" Daniel asked, glancing down at her. She didn't respond, but her gaze held an urgency that told him everything he needed to know. With renewed determination, Daniel pressed forward. The air around the dome crackled as he approached, and he hesitated for a moment, unsure of what would happen if he stepped through. But then Lyra's hand went limp, and a surge of fear shot through him. "I'm not losing you now," he said firmly. He stepped into the dome. The world changed instantly. The biting cold vanished, replaced by a warmth that seeped into his skin. The harsh wind was gone, replaced by a serene stillness. Inside, the landscape was different. A lush, glowing meadow stretched out before him, filled with strange, otherworldly plants that seemed to hum with life. Daniel looked down at Lyra. Her skin began to glow faintly again, the warmth of the dome seemingly reviving her. Her breathing steadied, and her eyes opened fully, widening in astonishment at the sight around them. "You recognize this place," Daniel said softly. She nodded, her strength slowly returning. With his help, she stood, though she leaned heavily on him for support. Her gaze swept across the meadow, a mixture of awe and sadness in her expression. "What is this place?" Daniel asked, looking around. Lyra placed a hand on her chest, then gestured to the dome and the glowing plants. Her voice, though still weak, was steady as she spoke. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. This was a sanctuary, a remnant of her people's advanced technology. "Your family left you behind, but they left this too," Daniel said, piecing it together. "A way for you to survive." She nodded again, but her expression darkened, and she shook her head, gesturing toward the outer wasteland. "They abandoned you," Daniel said, his voice soft. "They thought you weren't strong enough." Lyra's eyes met his, and he saw the pain in them, but also something else. Resolve. She placed a hand on his chest, her touch warm, and said a single word. "Strong." Daniel blinked, stunned. "You think I'm strong?" Lyra shook her head, gesturing between them. "Together. Strong." Her words hit him harder than he expected. In her simple way, she had summed up something he hadn't realized himself, that they had survived because they had each other. Before he could respond, the symbols around the dome began to spin faster, and a low hum filled the air. Lyra straightened, her glow intensifying as the dome reacted to her presence. "Is this a way to call for help?" Daniel asked, watching as she stepped away from him, toward the center of the dome. She nodded, but there was something hesitant in her movements. She looked back at him, her violet eyes filled with unspoken words. "You're not leaving me behind, are you?" Daniel asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Lyra hesitated, then shook her head. She gestured for him to join her hand reaching out. Daniel didn't need any more convincing. He stepped forward, and as their hands touched, the dome erupted in a brilliant flash of light. When the light faded, they stood in the same meadow, but the dome was gone, replaced by a clear view of the stars above. A small, sleek ship hovered nearby, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. Lyra turned to him, her expression soft but firm. She gestured to the ship, then to him, as if asking a question. "You want me to come with you?" Daniel asked, his heart racing. She nodded. For a moment, Daniel was silent. He looked back at the frozen wasteland beyond the meadow, then at Lyra. The answer was obvious. "Yeah," he said, smiling. "Let's see what's out there." Together, hand in hand, they walked toward the ship, leaving behind the cold and the loneliness. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was living.